Hi, and welcome to Total Rewind, a Filmmakers Compass podcast where we take a look at movies 30 years and older and see if they still hold up. I'm D-Man, joined by my co-host CP, and we have another good discussion in store for you guys, revolving around a Stanley Kubrick classic. So CP, I'll throw it over to you. Go ahead and introduce the movie today.
Today, we're going to be watching we've already watched it. We're going to be talking about the very controversial film, A Clockwork Orange, as Dustin said.
Nice.
Directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring, Malcolm McDowell is really the star of the movie.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the entire movie is literally from his perspective. It's his experience, which is interesting, and we'll get into that. Mm-hmm. So, as you mentioned, it was kind of a controversial film when it was released. And, that's for a number of different reasons. It depicts a rape by the protagonist of the story.
It actually depicts multiple rapes.
Yeah, but I mean, like, by the protagonist, which is, crazy. It's a number of, it's one of a number of movies in the 70s. We talked about Taxi Driver and different things that really pushed the boundaries of violence in film. I believe this is notable because A Clockwork Orange actually received an X rating. Mm-hmm. Which is pretty crazy in and of itself. Like, I can't even remember what the last film is that got an X rating. I should have Googled it.
Might be A Clockwork Orange.
Yeah, it might be. I don't even think they hand those out anymore. But I mean, we have to remember that the time this was released, they were still relaxing some of the, kind of regular rules around what was in cinema, right? I think it was Alfred Hitchcock's, was it Psycho, where they like showed a toilet for the first time,
yeah,
that's like, and that was in Psycho, was like what, the 50s or the
60s.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the first time we saw a toilet in a movie. Then you can imagine we get to A Clockwork Orange 10 years later. You're like, they blew the lid off this thing.
Yeah. Another, at the time, people attributed a lot of acts of violence in the 70s and the early 80s to A Clockwork Orange. And actually, that's one of the reasons why Kubrick placed a ban on public showings of it, because he was apparently receiving death threats because people saw this movie directly impacting events in the world.
Well, I mean, the gang is, pretty, they have that, I guess, youthful exuberance. Like when you see them at the theater and they're like having fun, they're relatable in that like teenage sense, but the amount of crime and violence that they're committing willingly, almost for fun, is still pretty crazy when you watch it today.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's, something that makes this, we call this Total Rewind, and we're looking at movies 30 years and older and them holding up. The fact that this is set in like a dystopian kind of future, does that, you think, impact its ability to stand up? Is that why the theme of like teenagers being rowdy and, well, at face value, terrible criminals too, does that help it hold up? I think it does.
I think so too. I think obviously the themes that Kubrick is looking at are very universal themes that are just as relevant today as they were in the 1970s. And that's the other reason why.
Yeah, it's toying around with themes of, aversion therapy, totalitarianism,
civil liberties,
yeah,
freedom, an individual's freedom, morality. There's a lot going on in this movie.
Which, again, I think is really contributes to why the movie stands up, why people still check it out after all these years. And it's really the themes. I mean, the main character is a fascinating character in that he's representative of evil, I guess. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, he's not a good person, but it's his journey, kind of. So he's not, he's basically a villain. Mm-hmm. And yet we're made to feel compassion for that person because they have their free will essentially removed.
Yeah.
Where it's like, hey, even if you're the worst of the worst, is that where we want to get to? And that's a really powerful theme. I mean, I think, on the most surface level in our culture today, where we're seeing that is probably on like social media platforms and, the dopamine hits that people are getting and influence it has. Not that people are losing their free will or it's aversion therapy, but we've seen the success of social media advertising and marketing campaigns can sway the masses to really, go after essentially fake news, conspiracy theories, things that, aren't necessarily grounded in fact and logic. So, those themes are alive and well today. And yeah, I think it's a big part of why this movie is culturally relevant and will continue to be.
No,
So,
absolutely.
Yeah, another thing that really stands out to me is the actual aversion therapy or whatever they call it in this movie. I forget. Where they have him, they put the helmet on, they open his eyes. Here's this guy who ultimately, he's a bad dude, but kind of, a little bit like a tough guy. You kind of think like, is this really going to work on this guy? Like there's probably a lot of like weak-willed people where this might work. And you're like, I don't know. But sure as shit, it goes through and works. And, guy freaking hates his favorite music now, Beethoven, the idea of like a topless woman makes him puke, like crazy
he's unable
stuff.
to stand up for himself in any confrontation. Yeah, it's insane.
And is there anyone better to like kind of convey this than Kubrick in his such cool like cinematography and the way he frames things and does stuff? Like I cannot imagine. I don't even want to imagine this movie if it was made by like Spielberg.
No, that's a good point. And probably part of the reason, obviously the book was around for 15 years before the movie. I never read it, so I don't know the differences. I heard that the book has a more optimistic ending than the film. And I guess Kubrick did that intentionally. He wanted to make the audience uncomfortable and he wanted us to feel this jarring impact. But I think you're absolutely right. If anyone other than Kubrick was helming this film, I don't think we would be talking about it today.
Yeah, it's
because the impact it has on a viewer is not so much the content of the film, it's the way Kubrick presents it to us and the conflict that he leaves within us.
Yeah. And it's, I think we have to talk a little bit about the cinematography because it's kind of a jarring yet beautifully shot film. I mean, Kubrick's known for his framing, right? He's known for filling an image. And here he's constantly doing that. But the way he does certain things just make you uncomfortable. Like I said, the aversion therapy scene, it makes me uncomfortable. Like I wouldn't want to go through that. Obviously, the rape scene, the famous one, is terrible. Like when you watch it, it's just gross. Like you feel gross watching it. And again, like you said, that's also because of the content, the nature of what we're watching, but the way that Kubrick films it makes you feel almost worse. So,
no, you're right. In fact, in many of these acts of violence that we're experiencing early on in the film, he makes us, the audience, almost feel like we're there presently witnessing it. Whereas most filmmakers shy away from it, he really leans into it and it makes you feel so uncomfortable. And that's intentional because we need to see how terrible Alex is.
Right. Definitely.
And seeing how terrible he is, yet seeing what the state does to him, leaves us in this very complicated state.
Yeah, right. And that goes back to this kind of, you have this evil-natured guy, but yet somehow the film makes us feel that sort of either, I guess, empathy for him, where we're like, man, as bad as someone is this really the outcome we want? And, I think ultimately the answer is no. I mean, the film kind of posits too by the end that that's not really the right way to go.
Yeah.
Even though there's terrible people out there and they're going to do terrible acts. A government in particular, what do they say? Like absolute power corrupts absolutely. Like even if you start out right, like good intentioned and you're like, no, like we're only using this just to stop the ultra super violent criminals. Like That's it. You know that eventually that'll be eroded, the bar will be lowered, and then it's like, anybody that disagrees, we're going to condition you, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And if you introduce something like that, I mean, 100% that's what would happen over time. It would just get abused.
No, absolutely. Just going back to cinematography, right? A couple things that Kubrick does really cool is he plays a lot with power angles when he's introducing characters to show who's in power over who. I think the most famous example of this is at the demonstration where they are demonstrating to the politicians that Alex is a changed man.
Yeah.
Right. These power angles, suddenly the dynamics are flipped and everyone else is so superior to him that as an audience, we know he's a changed man. Where in the beginning, Alex is shown in a very strong position. Kubrick constantly puts us at eye level where we are looking into the eyes of Alex himself and almost seeing the face of this monster. And he also lets us see into the eyes of the victims. So we can firsthand experience their horrors and their trauma, which I think
does, it's very powerful. It works.
I think the best shot is during is when the man, the one who ends up in the wheelchair at the end of the film, Frederick, when we see him witnessing the rape scene. I think it's horrifying. He's gagged and bound, and we as an audience are just looking into his eyes, and you can't help but feel horrible and powerless like him. And again, that's Kubrick's framing of the shot.
It's very well done. I like what he does too with colors. He's playing, obviously there's reds in certain spots, there's muted colors in others. He's wearing white, symbology in a lot of, what he's, trying to convey to the audience. I do think, it's interesting too, because it's kind of like a dystopian society. So it feels to me like the way it's shot is, a lot of the locations, the set design, things like that, they feel dystopian. They feel like slightly off, but very familiar.
And I think that was intentional. I think he's trying to show this is a near future and this could be the future, right? People are living in a world that is very 1960s, 1970s in terms of architecture, style, fashion. What he does is, I think he shocks us into feeling like foreigners, like this could be a dystopian future. And I think one of the ways he really does that is by the sexual imagery everywhere, especially for, more, in the past when they were more conservative, that this was probably even more jarring to an audience where every single household, right? He's sitting there talking to his parents and there's statues of penises and naked women on the walls. And
doesn't somebody get hit in the head with a penis?
I think they get murdered with a penis.
Right.
And he's showing us that this is not a world that we live in. This is a society which is in some ways degraded beyond our current moral standards.
Interesting. Yeah. That's kind of what I was getting at. Like the way it just feels slightly different, but very familiar. Like you said, it's still like a 60s kind of vibe, like it still kind of has that. So it's familiar. You're there. You feel like, okay, like I could see it, but then, there's just these elements of it that you're like, what the hell? That's weird. But screw it. It works. I think.
I mean, it has the effect on the viewer.
I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on during the rape scene, he is singing in the rain?
I did read, apparently that was not a Kubrick call. That was a Malcolm McDonald call. He thought that there was an element missing from this, and he added it himself. And I think in a lot of ways, it makes it so much more horrifying because Alex is presented as even more an animal because he enjoys this and it doesn't seem to affect him. And he's almost taking this lighthearted approach to the fact that he is terrorizing these people and enjoying it. I think it.
Yeah. And I think too, the use of Singing in the Rain terrorizes us personally. We all know that song. We have a nice association with that song.
It's lighthearted and fun.
To put that there, makes us even more uncomfortable because now we're like, damn it, if I go watch Singing in the Rain, is it ruined? Like, is this aversion therapy right now? Like,
you're right. You're absolutely right.
Can I watch that and not think of this? This is terrible. You're ruining Singing in the Rain for me.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. I liked the use of Beethoven as kind of a trigger, as it's classical music. It's music that allows the movie to remain kind of timeless in that sense, right? This is a dystopian future, and yet here's Beethoven from, centuries ago.
You're right, especially with a lot of the science fiction of the time. They were leaning into the much more metallic, artificial soundtracks.
Yeah.
So for him to rely on very classical music, I think in some ways it touches us in a different way. And it probably brings this almost humanistic element to the film that is otherwise very absent.
So I didn't know this. Did you know that the title, A Clockwork Orange, is in reference to organic on the outside, mechanical on the inside?
No, I did not know that.
So A Clockwork Orange then is actually a reference to a person that has gone through that aversion therapy. They appear normal on the outside, but they're mechanical on the inside now.
Did not know that.
That's
interesting.
Yeah, Alex actually embodies that. He's a Clockwork Orange. And another thing I read, which in preparation for this episode, apparently the phrase A Clockwork Orange is never actually mentioned in the film. So I believe it is in the book, but not in the movie. Now, I don't know if that was intentional on his part, but the only reason I bring that up is because I had to look up what A Clockwork Orange meant. And the movie doesn't solve that for us. It doesn't directly tell us this is what it means. You have to do some digging, or, hopefully this podcast, if you're listening now, right? That's how you know. So, but finally, when we take a look at the story, I think the number one theme in the movie is about, free will. And Alex exemplifies this because literally at face value, they're like, he's cured, but he's not cured because on the inside, he would still commit the evil acts if it weren't for these freaking triggers, right? So they didn't change his mind. He doesn't necessarily think differently. He just can't do it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're robbing somebody of their free will, but it's not, I would call that unsuccessful. You're just forcing people to be basically robots at that point.
Well, and I think that's the point. I think it's very much a film about unintended consequences. On face value, the government says, look, we have gotten rid of crime. We can rehabilitate people and they can go back into society and not be criminals anymore. Yay, us. And they all celebrate. Yet we see the havoc that it wreaks on this man, and it hasn't fixed him. He still is the same evil, sadistic person. And at the end of the movie, we know he is going to go back out there and continue mugging and raping and murdering because that's who he is. He's a sociopath deep down. But all they did was rob him of his free will. Truly, it's a conversation about morality, and he's still the same person as before. He hasn't changed. There's a great component of the movie, right, where the pastor in the prison stands up and he talks about how Alex is still the same person. This isn't him growing as a human being. This isn't him embracing a new moral code. He's still the same person deep down. It's just he doesn't have the ability to act.
Right.
And he's kind of the only person in the film initially who is willing to defend how heinous this is. Even at the end when he meets the group of dissidents, they really just want to use this for their own insight so they can assume power, right? They can use this as an opportunity to punish Alex further. They're not actually interested in what are the true consequences of this. And we're stripping human beings of their fundamental right, which is the right to choose.
Well, and what's interesting too about like morality and free will in this case is that the morality comes back to us, where we say, is Alex even worthy of this free will? Because what is his ability to choose if not just a jail cell, right? Mm-hmm. A jail cell removes all your choices. Technically, you're still thinking the same. You would do the same things, but you can't do shit in a jail cell. Yeah. What is it if not just a jail cell of your mind? So the morality comes back to us, where we have to answer the question, is Alex even worthy of not having this happen to him?
Mhm.
Maybe he deserves it. He's a
Mhm.
real piece of shit. Maybe, screw you. You lose your free will. You're terrible.
Yeah.
That's on you.
Well, and
I think so. It's weird because, how do I feel about that? It's like, yeah, I mean, you could rot in a jail cell. Like, you get meals handed to you. You don't get to pick what you eat. You don't get to pick what you wear. You don't get to pick where you go. Technically, you have your mind, but he still has his mind. He can think what he wants. He just can't act on it.
well, and I think that a lot of that, I think that's why Kubrick included this element of, as Alex says, Ludwig von, right?
Yeah.
It's finally at that level, we see how far they've really gone, that the most fundamental things have been robbed of him. His ability to listen to the music that he loves has been stripped away.
Yeah.
This most basic element of freedom that, you're right, even if you are riding in a jail cell, you could still whistle Beethoven. You could still listen to Beethoven. You could still think about it. And for him, he's so fundamentally deprived of that very basic freedom that we take for granted. And I think the intention there is to truly put us as the audience in this conflicted spot the whole time, where we're thinking, have they gone too far? Does he deserve this? Is this just, karma for the terrible things that we witnessed him do in the first hour of the film?
Yeah, no, and then there's also the morality of, like, okay, right? He doesn't have his free will, but instead of paying for his crime and staying in for the entirety of his sentence, if he goes through the aversion therapy, he gets released.
Mm-hmm.
They say, hey, we can release this guy because what do we actually have is he's not a threat to anyone anymore. Mm-hmm. But he never even paid for the freaking crime. Like, if you commit a rape, even if you have aversion therapy, like, you should still go through the sentence, like, what the hell's that? And I get it. It's like kind of a, pilot program here. So they're saying, like, if you agree, like, we'll release you early, but still, you could see that as being like, kind of a, I don't know if they would ever mandate aversion therapy, but if it was voluntary by people in jail, they could elect to get lighter sentences in favor of aversion therapy.
Much like Alex did.
Yeah. So I don't know, like, then there's, the whole idea of, like, just because you commit good acts, just because we can make you a robot and you won't do anything bad now, you still got to pay for your crime.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you still did it.
And I think at the end, because we spend an hour watching Alex do terrible things, and we see that he's really just an evil person in every way. Then when we see him go through his sentence and we see how he has been transformed, not as a person, right? He's still, as you said, the same shitty person. He just is unable to act, and his free will has been stripped of him. Kubrick does this master job of looking at issues like incarceration, right? Mm-hmm. And rehabilitation, which in other ways you don't really understand, outside of this film. It's very hard for us to have this conversation of how far is too far.
Right.
And the story does a great job of making us look at these things in a way which the best sci-fi does. It presents an issue in a different way to an audience, and it forces us to experience it and walk out of it debating these themes.
Yeah, like, another great theme that comes from the movie is literally incarceration, and us, being reflexive and taking a look at our prison system, right? Because here the movie posits that if this is available, it will be abused, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As if our own current prison system hasn't been abused or taken advantage of people, or, what I mean? Like, the system we have is already, corrupted and all that type of stuff. Right. It's not like we have a perfect prison system now and we're just trying to make it better.
Yeah. Well, right. And continuing the themes of this idea that power corrupts absolutely, right? Yeah. The government really has no interest in Alex as a person. They have no interest in actually helping him at a core fundamental level. Yeah. They want to be able to say that they've reduced crime. They want to say that they've rehabilitated criminals so they can go out there and work as contributing members of society. Yet
Right.
when they realize that it's gone wrong, it's not even this act of, oh my gosh, we have wronged you. How can we rehabilitate you? No, the government only comes back after there's all this backlash in the press of people, where all these newspapers and media outlets are condemning them for this atrocity that they created. Then they come back in an effort to save face and they say, hey, we're going to fix you. We're going to give you everything. We're going to take care of you. But it's just about them staying in control and maintaining power.
I did want to ask you, one thing that stood out to me as well is there's a scene where he sees his old members of the gang and they're cops now.
Mm-hmm.
Again, when you play with that idea of like morality, like, should those guys be cops? Should they have the privilege of even getting to put on the uniform after the things we know they've done? And again, have they really changed? Or are they, just criminals dressed up as cops that are probably going to abuse that power?
Well, and I think this is a brilliant thing that Kubrick's doing again. And I assume part of this is based in the original novel. But the idea is when his old gang finds him out of prison, they treat him just like they would anyone else. They abuse their power. They are still the same fundamental, terrible human beings trying to hurt and take advantage of other people. The only difference is they have badges on their chest making it legal.
Right.
And there is a line where the government says something about, the idea that we need to have stronger cops on the street to make sure that crimes are dealt with more swiftly so we can get people into the system and get them processed out. And again, it's this idea of the more power that someone has, the more they become corrupted and the more power they seek by any means necessary.
Fair enough. I don't know if there's anything else you want to hit on. I mean, I did want to just add one note that apparently these characters did appear in the Space Jam: A New Legacy trailer. So in terms of cultural relevance, I guess there's that.
I did not know that.
I don't even know if they were in the movie, but they were in the trailer.
I think what impresses me most is I think that as a sci-fi film, what Kubrick did is he is not inventing this world of grandiose technologies, right? There's not space travel. There's not time travel. There's not all these kind of high concept components of a sci-fi film that we expect. Instead, he shows us a world that is not very unfamiliar.
Right. Yeah.
In the sense that we can imagine ourselves being there in a few years. And in this film, he focuses on people and he shows us how the costs of decisions have unintended consequences and what those are and he roots this whole concept of science fiction in a very relatable human place. And I think that's why it holds up. Yeah, we're not looking at it for effects. We're looking at it for the message and this emotional journey that the audience goes on.
Yeah, I have to agree. My verdict on A Clockwork Orange is it definitely holds up. The themes, I think this is actually one of my favorite movies where I'm like, I think what really is important from A Clockwork Orange are the themes. I think they're very relevant. I think the story gets, like you said, it gets you thinking, it gets you re-examining yourself and maybe even some of our institutions. And because of Kubrick's direction and his ability to create this kind of timeless story that, like you said, thanks to the lack of pop culture references, the lack of, 70s sci-fi effects for the sake of effects, the movie does have this quality where it's like you can watch it today and it looks just as good as it did when it, originally released. And the themes are just as important now today as they ever were.
Well, and I think that's part of it, right? And that's why I think it holds up. If we were watching this movie 20 years ago, as we're having this, global conversation about, right to privacy and the surveillance state and the Patriot Act, this movie would be relevant. 10 years ago, as we're having this conversation about corrections reform, this movie is relevant now as we're having this conversation, regarding that we're having right now regarding vaccination mandates and vaccine passports and all these things. This movie still comes into play. It's the individual, it's the government, and how far can each one go before
Perfect.
they've truly violated the other one and the institutional and fundamental rights.
Fantastic. Yeah.
The movie is uncomfortable. It's not a movie that you're going to throw on and watch for fun. It's not a movie that, when you want to have a good time and crack open a beer, you're going to watch. But it's a powerful movie, and it's just as powerful now as it was in the 70s.
Well said. And I think that's where we'll end the discussion on our end. But I agree. And I think if you haven't had a chance to check it out, you should definitely go watch A Clockwork Orange. I think you'll really enjoy it. And if anything, like I said, it'll get you thinking. So maybe you're uncomfortable. Maybe you didn't like it. You won't watch it again. But I think it's worth viewing. It's one of those movies that, everybody should just take a look once you're an adult and use it as it is. So on that note, wanted to say thank you, everyone, so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed the episode. If you have anything that you would like to throw out there, be sure to comment on the social media posts or on YouTube and let us know your thoughts. I think it was pretty easy to answer whether A Clockwork Orange holds up or not, but that might not be the case for other people. So if you disagree, be sure to let us know. I haven't said this before, but I also wanted to let everyone know, if you're listening, if you enjoy the podcast, go ahead and go to Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts. Leave us a review. Leave us a 5-star review. And if you think we're only a 3-star podcast, feel free to do that too. But we appreciate 5 stars. But we'd love to hear from you guys and get feedback from you directly about, what do you like about the show? Is there anything else you'd want to see on here? And we'll have some production meetings behind the scenes and try to, make the show the best it can be. So you can follow me at Big Kid D-Man. You can follow CP at NDCal5. You can find the show by typing Filmmakers Compass into Google. It'll bring up our website. It has all our links to social, YouTube, and all the podcast directories. So thank you, everybody. We appreciate you tuning in. CP, I'll throw it over to you. Take us out.
Next week, we're going to be watching another very uncomfortable movie, Deer Hunter. But until then, keep watching movies, and we're going to see you next week.